Hello and welcome to the Elder Tree podcast. My name is Twiggy Dawn. I'm the founder of the Elder Tree and Alchemilla Herbals, and I reside on Jitterbug land here in far north Queensland. You are listening to the Herbal Education segment, where each new moon I invite a myriad of plant wisdom keepers to chat about the world of herbal education, about their passions and motivations, and their dreams for the future of herbal medicine education in Australia. This podcast is brought to you by the Elder Tree, a non-for-profit organisation whose mission is putting the medicine in the hands of the people. One of the ways that we are doing this is through this podcast. If you would like to go deeper with the podcast journey while supporting the Elder Tree for as little as $2 per week, then you can become a member of our Patreon. Thanks to all of the people and plants who have helped to make this podcast possible. In today's episode, I interview Sue Evans, a respected herbalist, teacher, and herbal historian on Wurrundjeri country in Melbourne. Sue has an incredible bird's-eye view on Australian herbalism, spanned over the past almost 50 years of her education and career. And when she did her PhD, she really dived into the herbal history of Australia since European settlement and some of the challenges that herbalists have faced over this time. Sue herself has a rich history of herbal education, starting with training at the National Institute of Medical Herbalists in the UK. In Australia, Sue taught at the Southern School of Natural Therapies, and later she moved to the Southern Cross University in Lismore, where she was part of the first university course in naturopathy in Australia. After nearly 20 years there, she returned to Melbourne and continued teaching online with the University of Tasmania. Throughout her career, Sue practiced herbal medicine for about 25 years, was part of the first integrative clinic in Melbourne, and was involved in the establishment of the Victorian Herbalists Association during a politically charged time when the Therapeutic Goods Act was introduced. Sue has been a huge advocate for herbalist rights and also for the rights of the plants, promoting a more sustainable way of managing the industry that has emerged with the import of herbs for clinical practice. In this interview, we explore the repeating patterns through history of herbalists being oppressed by the government and the allopathic medical industry. We discuss what history has been lost or misplaced, and Sue shares her wisdom that we need only to look to the landscape and the plants to find the history written. Sue also shares her story of being at the first ever meeting of the American Herbalist Guild and how a previous conversation with Michael Tierra catalyzed the American Herbalist Guild to form. We actually cover so much in this interview, and yet it feels like the tip of the iceberg. I feel really blessed and honored to have the opportunity to chat about these things with Sue, and I really hope that you enjoy listening. Hello, Sue. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Elder Tree podcast today. How are you going?
Good to see you again, Twiggy. Yeah. Enjoyed meeting up with you in Tassie at Christmas. It was lovely.
Yeah, that was really beautiful getting to be at Marlene Herbs with you and Greg and Dawn and everyone there. That was really special. I was really glad that aligned. I'm happy to have you on the show here today as someone that I really admire and a herbal historian, and I've really loved watching your work, and I feel like you hold a really important piece that hasn't been explored in this podcast, because we've been very focused when we've talked about the past. We've been very focused on the individual, but you have such a depth of understanding of the herbal history in Australia and the naturopathic history in Australia. It's been 50 years. You've got 50 years of experience since you first started out with your herbal education. So I'd love to start off with just asking you to share a bit about that journey, whatever you feel to this past 50 years, and some whatever you feel to share with the listeners.
Yeah, a bit unbelievable to think that it's been that long. So I travelled to the UK in the mid-70s, and soon after that enrolled with the National Institute of Medical Herbalists to train in herbal medicine. So I started training in 77. So that's nearly, it's getting on for 50 years ago. So I trained with Hans Zelstra, people like Simon Mills, in those years. And then in the early 80s, in 82, after I graduated from that course, I came home to Melbourne to practice, and fairly soon was teaching at Southern School of Natural Therapies. Taught at Southern School for 10 years. Then the opportunity came to move to Southern Cross University in Lismore, New South Wales, to be part of the first university course in naturopathy in Australia. And so I was teaching herbal medicine up there for nearly 20 years until that course folded. Then I came back to Melbourne, thinking that my academic career, that, hey, to actually be teaching herbal medicine in a university was pretty unusual and a pretty amazing opportunity. But soon after I came back to Melbourne, University of Tasmania said, hey, would you like to do some online teaching? So I've been teaching with University of Tasmania for, I guess the sadness is that I no longer teach practitioners, but it's wonderful to still be involved in that time. So I guess, so that's the teaching bit. Within that time, I probably practiced for about 25 years, and I was part of the first integrative medical clinic in Melbourne in the late 80s. Got very involved with was one of the founding members of Victorian Herbalists Association from, again, in the mid to late 80s, which was instigated by some graduates graduates from Southern School saying, oh, look, we need somewhere to talk about herbs. That was quite a political time, because the Therapeutic Goods Act was just being introduced. What other? There are so many strands to it. Like there's some, the story, the story of your life, the story of your career is just not one thing. There's, there were kids came along, and then there were. Then I think we might have mentioned the other day that when I finished my course in the UK, it was great, but there were, your course finishes and then you really need to start to learn. And one of the things that I felt that I didn't have at that time was a relationship with the plants themselves. But I was extremely fortunate to meet Greg Whitten in the mid 80s, I suppose. And so, and that was when he was living in Victoria. And so for quite a number of years then, the kids and I would spend, time pretty regularly up at Green Farm, up at Twin Creeks. And that was a very important part of my herbal education, was actually connecting with the plants. Later on, when I was at Southern Cross, of course, I got involved with a number of different bits of research. Spent some time in South America on a couple of research projects, and at that time was starting my PhD, and had amazing ideas when I started my PhD that I was going to compare. I was working with an indigenous group in Chile. I was going to compare, that herbal medicine with, herbal medicine in Australia. And of course, it's like, nah, I didn't have the skills to do that. But my PhD ended up looking at my own situation, I suppose, and actually finding out, okay, what's the history of Western herbal medicine in Australia? So they're just some of the things. And these days I teach at UTAS. I'm involved with the Jacker Foundation for Natural Therapies. I work in the community garden. I'm a grandma. All of that. Life's good.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that speedy overview of 50 years of your personal journey. Yeah. And I'm sure the herbal medicine community, the herbal medicine, what it is to be a practitioner 50 years ago compared to now, or what it is to be an educator, the opportunities that are available then compared to now must be like so different. You must have seen so many changes over that time.
Yeah, yeah. I feel really privileged to have been, yeah, to have seen so many changes, and to have seen. I think when I started, probably one of the biggest things was when I was a student in the 70s, and talking to my fellow students in the 70s, and we would say, wouldn't it be fantastic if everybody used herbal medicine? But in those days, of course, there wasn't an industry. So the only thing that we could imagine, the only way that everybody could use herbal medicine would be if everybody was growing chamomile in their backyard. Like it wasn't, you could go to a health food shop and you could buy some herbal teas, but there weren't products. And so it is a thing about be careful what you wish for. Also, I guess at that time, we always felt quite marginalised, and there was this move towards mainstream. Well, the industry and integration and those changes have brought a lot of opportunities to us, but also there's been a cost to that, and I think, okay, so moving forward, probably 15 years or so after I graduated, there was the introduction of the Therapeutic Goods Act in Australia. And that was such an amazing affirmation. It was the first time that in Australia that our medicines had been officially recognised as therapeutic. And before that they were not food, not medicine. And the TGA came in and they were accepted as having a therapeutic action. But oh my goodness, what a cost! The cost has been, there was the Therapeutic Goods Act, and the Therapeutic Goods Act came in at about the same time that evidence-based medicine became really important, and so there was those two things, and those two things kind of moved together, and yeah. So we now have an explosion of product, but I think the deep sadness that I feel about my profession and about the whole popularity of herbal medicine is that it was such an opportunity for humans to strengthen their relationship with the planet and to strengthen their appreciation of nature. Because if we depend on nature for when we're ill, if we depend on her for our healing, then we will look after her.
Yeah.
But that hasn't happened. And because of the way that things have gone, and some of that is the Therapeutic Goods Act, and it's that acceptance, what has happened has been that the herbal medicines industry is contributing to extinction of species, and it's just such a sadness that it hasn't gone another way, but so it's, I guess the fights continue, and I suppose the other thing that it's like we're herbalists, but we're not separate from the world. So for some reason, if you believe in reincarnations, for some reason we have decided to incarnate as herbalists in Australia, in the 21st century. And so we're not, yes, we're in a capitalist society, and we're not, we're in a very urbanized society. And the thing is, how do we interpret our craft? How do we live authentically as plant people, while living, for me, in an apartment in inner city Melbourne? It's that's the challenge, and it's not an impossibility, but it's certainly different to if one thinks about the life of Culpeper, or the life of herbalist, Juliet de Berkeley Levy, or all sorts of people. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I remember something that you were talking to me yesterday about was how you found some resources from like the 1800s in Australia that really portrayed a bit of some similar struggles that herbalists were having then as what they're having now. Do you mind sharing a bit about that?
This was when I realised that my PhD couldn't be as exotic as I had fantasised, and I needed and really what was in front of me was, okay, what is the story of Western herbal medicine in Australia? Because one of the other big questions that of my life, of all of our lives, is what does it mean to be a herbalist in Australia? What does it mean to be a Western herbalist in Australia, where we're using an imported materia medica? The plants come from Europe or from the States. And of course, one of the things, herbs came out on the First Fleet. One of the things about Joseph Banks and about the First Fleet is that there are so many records, and so we have records of which herbs came out on the First Fleet, and we know that on the First Fleet arrived 26th of January 1788, and by the 1st of March 1788, only 5 weeks later, a herb garden had been established in the Rocks in Sydney to provide the needs for Sydney General Hospital. And so for those first, so that was 1788. So for that first, certainly until the 1850s, and really until 1900, there was a system of medical pluralism in Australia, which meant that doctors didn't have particular rights over other practitioners, that there were many different sorts of health practitioners working in Australia. And one of the things when I was researching my PhD, and I was finding all sorts of trouble actually getting records of, were there people called herbalists working? Yes, we know the herbs came, but was there a profession of herbalists? And there were, a few hints here and there. And then I remember thinking at one time, well, when Victorian Herbalist Association heard about the Therapeutic Goods Act was coming in, we lobbied. We went to Parliament and we lobbied, and we got some changes, in the very minor changes, but we did actually make our voice heard when the Therapeutic Goods Act was going through, because we were concerned. And I thought, well, okay, if there were herbalists around when doctors started to get more and more power from the 1850s, would they have done the same thing? So I went back and looked at the debates in Victorian State Parliament that were recorded every time a bill came into Parliament between 1851 and I think it was like 1870, the 1870s. And I looked at the record of the debate, and every time a bill came in giving more rights to doctors, the debate on the floor of the House in Victorian State Parliament was, but what about the herbalists? What about the homeopaths? What about the herbalists? What about the homeopaths? Which, of course, then it's like, oh, okay, so who are these people? So then, you've got to be a bit obsessive when you do a PhD. So then I went to the Public Records Office of Victoria and found correspondence between, somebody called the Secretary of the Australian Union of Herbalists. I also went to Victorian State Library and looked for some records there. Couldn't find anything. Went up to chat to a librarian at one stage, and librarians are diamond. I mean, they're just amazing people. And I said, look, I've been looking for records about herbalists and I can't find any. And she asked me some questions and did some digging and came up with, she said, oh, look, we've got copies of the Australasian Journal of Botanic Medicine Practitioners between 1887 and 1892. So there was a journal. There was a journal of botanic medicine practitioners. So clearly we were really organised. So actually, and then I found one of the things I found was in the late 1800s. There of course there's been lots of occasions where herbalists have felt as if they were going to become they were going to be that practice was going to become illegal, right? And there was a petition with 5,000 signatures in the late 1800s requesting state parliament not to make herbalists illegal, supporting herbal medicine. So, I mean, this whole story, like, when I came home in 1982, like there wasn't the history of herbal medicine was really difficult to come by. It seems like it started with Dorothy Hall and Dennis Stewart in New South Wales, like in the 60s and 70s. But actually, it goes way back, and there do seem to have been herbalists in Australia, Western herbalists in Australia, pretty much since the first fleet. So that was, but also, lots of stories of persecution and marginalisation, and lots of stories where it seems like herbalists been told to, well, the reaction has been keep your head down, don't. So one of the stories is that of Charlie Noakes in the 1950s in New South Wales. Charlie Noakes was president of the National Herbalists Association. And for 10 years, between 1940s and 1950s, Truth newspaper, which was a sensationalist rag, ran a campaign to try and discredit and outlaw people who were not registered medical practitioners. And Charlie Noakes felt that he was defamed in the Truth newspaper, took the Truth newspaper to court, to the New South Wales Supreme Court, and won the case. But when the story was told to me by Lindsay Shum, Lindsay Shum's the person who started Herbal Extract Company, and he was a young herbalist in the 50s. When the story of Charlie Noakes was pretty well known within the herbal circles, and it was like, okay, all right, so Charlie Noakes took on the Truth newspaper and won, but he won, can't remember what it was, but he won like 10 shillings or something. Like, I mean, it was not, he didn't, it was a peppercorn, victory, or very small victory. But during the time that he was fighting this court case, he lost his practice. His family, he lost his family, he lost his house, so the story that Lindsay learnt as a young herbalist was, that you certainly are very cautious about taking on power, and that probably better to keep your head down. So these there are stories there, but you've got to go digging for them. I guess when I came home, the first things that I saw were there had been a number of government inquiries into osteopathy, chiropractic, naturopathy. Interestingly, in 1961, which was the year that Alf and Judy Jacker started the Southern School, what ended up being the Southern School in their living room, there was a Royal Commission in Western Australia that recommended that naturopathy be banned. Now, it never was banned, but that was so there were a few government reports in the 70s. Then in 1985, there was a Victorian government report, and that report the committee was chaired by Judith Dixon, and one of the conclusions of that report was that the reality for many Victorians is that natural medicine is a primary form of healthcare. Now, that was the first time. So the reports before then, during the 70s, had all said, oh, look, the only people that use naturopathy are, people that are a bit eccentric, and, like that this is really, we don't need to worry about natural medicine because nobody uses it. But by the mid-80s, Judith Dixon said the reality for many Victorians is that natural medicine is a primary form of healthcare. And then it was only 5 years after that we got the Therapeutic Goods Act. So it's like when nobody was using natural medicine, or it was really under the radar, government didn't have to worry, But once it was, a lot of people were using it, then that, of course, is when government starts to regulate. So I feel like I'm going all over the place here, Twiggy.
No, it's great. Yeah. I mean, it's so true what you said about how, like, so many people think that the herbal education started in Australia with Dorothy Hall and Dennis Stewart, because, whenever I ask the elders that I've come across, like, where did their education start, or I've asked them where's the start of the string, as far as they know, that's where the string kind of starts. But I as I was expressing to you yesterday, the area that I live in, Far North Queensland, is kind of, most of it was founded around like mid 1800s, and I think by that time there was already quite like a severance. I don't see any medicine gardens having been planted like they did in the first fleet around here. Maybe it happened and maybe it's gotten lost, I don't know, but I think, like, kind of what I'm getting at is that so much has been lost.
Okay, so I'll tell you the story. Okay, so at one stage I was interested. There was the Wheeler family were an important family in the NHWA, right? And I think Robin Kirby wrote a book about the Wheelers, going back to when the great grandmother came out from England, okay? And when they came out, that first generation came out, it was a gold rush, right? And the story is that sorry, I can't remember her name. That she walked from Sydney to Hill End, which is quite a distance, and that a lot of it she walked in bare feet because she wanted to save her shoes, right? Because shoes were pretty important. Okay, so I went to Hill End in, I don't know, 2000s, some in the 2000s, and one of the things that was really interesting about getting there, and when I got there, there was a museum, and in one of the rooms of the museum, it was the history of the Hill End Hospital, right? And within that room, there was a tincture making press. I mean, it wasn't labelled as such, it was labelled as, I can't remember what it was labelled as. It's labelled as something else, but it was, I know what a tincture making press looks like. Everybody knows what herbalists know what a press looks like. Okay, so there was a press in that, and we know that one of the early matrons was a woman who was a herbalist. But then you go out into Hill End, Twiggy, and you see the biggest hawthorn trees you have ever seen in your life. You see a load of St. John's wort. You see, I mean, I think I counted, like just so many medicinal plants, right? And so, Blind Freddy, you put together, okay, you've got these, you've got, hawthorn trees, linden trees, you've got, centauri, and you've got all of these plants growing, and you've got a tincture press in the hospital. Well, 1 and 1, it's like, of course this is what happened when, of course, why were they planting those trees? How did those plants get there? I mean, one of the really interesting things is to go to any gold mining town and look at what the weeds are, and the weeds that will be there. Why are there so many elder trees? Why are there so many medicinal plants in those old gold mining towns? Well, maybe the history is not written in words, Twiggy, but it's written in the landscape. It's written in the plants. Yeah. So I think, we just need to not just look at the art. Well, look at art, expand our understanding of what an archive is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
That
beautiful. Thanks for that. Did you get to go inside the hospital at Hill End?
well, it
Was
had
that where
turned
you
into a
saw
museum.
the tincture press?
Yeah. The hospital, the old hospital, had been turned into a museum, and there was one
Oh,
room at the museum where there was the tincture
yeah.
press. Yeah, yeah.
That must have
Um,
been a while back that you went there, because I've been
oh,
in
it was.
every building in Hill End that's open to the public,
Yeah.
and I went to the hospital and specifically wanted to see any
Yeah.
remnants of herbal medicine because my ancestors are from Hill End, like they were some of the
Oh, okay.
founding
Wow.
families
Okay. Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you and I actually had this connection a while back because you sent me that book about the Wheeler family, and so yeah, so I've wandered the streets of Hill End a couple of times now and gone in any building that I can. And I wanted to get inside the hospital, and I had that interest of what herbal medicine was there, but it wasn't open for the public. So I was really bummed about that. And I'm really glad that you brought up about that tincture press because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just knew there was going to
And look,
be some things in there.
got a photo of it somewhere. Like, yes, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
yeah. Yeah, and it is like I guess that's one of the frustrating things about history, isn't it? It's like, well, what is important and what isn't important, and if you don't know, like if you're not a herbalist and you don't know the importance of something like that, then
Mm,
of course it's easy to get rid of. Just as like any kind of archivist, what um, what documents do you keep, and what documents
hmm
do you know do you throw out? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, could you imagine all the publications that were made then in the 1850s and beyond of like how do we grow herbs in this climate as Europeans and Chinese? There was a lot of Chinese settlers there too, but like how do we bring grow these herbs on these lands? There was probably all kinds of different publications that now aren't available. So
yeah,
it's really
yeah,
great that we have people like you that are going through the archives and taking the time at the libraries to find these things because
yeah,
otherwise we are a bit kind of
yeah.
ignorant.
Well, and
About the past.
and it is, well, okay. So who settled this like the different groups that settled this country? Why did they? I mean, one of the things that a lot of people have heard this story before, but I find it really interesting that in the Edinburgh Gardens in Fitzroy here in Melbourne, um, there's a circle of 13 elm trees in a perfect circle, and they were planted in the late 1800s. And you think, okay, was that just a design thing, or was that a kind of what sort of witchy thing? Like, and this wasn't 1970s feminists that were doing this. This
Mm,
is late 1800s. Um, and when people came out, when largely English came out and settled, say somewhere like Melbourne, in the 1800s and 1900s, what understanding of plants and of agriculture and of growing food, what did they bring? What was just the tacit understandings? What was just the common knowledge at that time? And sometimes you've got to go kind of sideways to find out what those are. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's there's just so many aspects to herbalism and the sacred realm. It's like and it's kind of how far back do you want to go in herbal history to look at the fear that kind of came about
yeah,
after the witch trials and all of that, back
yeah,
then,
yeah,
and kind
yeah,
of how suppressed
absolutely.
herbalism's been over time. And it's just it's really interesting when you kind of
Mm,
can have snapshots in time and also
mm,
see patterns that are still happening right now, in
sure.
this country and around the world as well, with
Yeah,
that oppression of herbal medicine and that
yeah, yeah.
the kind of trying to shut down the sacred elements and the medicinal elements and
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's really
yeah, yeah,
interesting. I
yeah.
mean, I wonder why. Like, I wonder. I don't really spend much time on agendas and thinking about conspiracy theories or anything like that, but it's just, it baffles me that this has been a replaying theme, a replaying pattern over history of like
Yeah, yeah,
herbalism being shut down and natural remedies being shut down. I don't know what the
yeah,
original wound is that's
yeah.
created this.
And certainly that was one of the uh, simultaneously inspiring and depressing things about looking back at, well, first of all, looking back at those journals from the 1880s and 1890s, and then going back and looking at the NHAA archives, which, at that time, Anne Cowper, who was the secretary of the NHAA in those days, had said to me, "Oh, look, somebody's just dropped off this big cardboard box, from that they found in their garage, and it's on top of one of the cupboards in the NHAA office. So I think you might be interested." And of course, it was, the archives. But the thing that was simultaneously depressing and inspiring was that the conversations and the concerns and the discussions were so familiar, about, were we going to have access to these particular plants, and what were the threats to practice, and interspersed with, slippery elm is great for this, and like what are the herbs that we might use for insomnia, and all that kind of stuff. It was just like, oh yeah, okay, yes, these people might have lived 100 years ago, but or 150 years ago, but I absolutely understand what they're talking about. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and really it hasn't, the concerns and the fights that they've had, really haven't changed enormously over that time. So, yeah, I don't know, in terms of, I mean, I don't think about conspiracy theories so much, but I certainly think about confluence of interest, and power, and and the power of, the power of finance, the power of, making a buck, the temptation to exploit the earth, all of that, you know, how do we decolonize herbal medicine, all of those kind of odd things. It's like, yeah. Um, what are we? Yeah. It's um, one of the I've always been interested in herbal history, and one of the unit, I guess, the unit that I loved teaching most at, when I was at Southern Cross was, just really, it felt like history of the world through herbs. So we can start off, we can blame colonization, on herbal medicine, because really what the early what the early explorers were trying to do was to find another way to the spice. Was to cut the Arab middlemen out of the spice trade. So that that was the impetus for the voyages of exploration. So all this, like Western civilization, that has, and plants and botany, is, fascinating area to look at. Okay, so yeah, how do we think about all that?
Mm. Yeah, they're just kind of going all around the world, just trying to find the next rubber tree and the next fever bark and just the next discovery and discovering the places that they found.
Well, medicinal plants, but also finding medicinal plants. I mean, that was one of the very early edicts from the Pope, was, was for the Spanish to go out and find medicinal plants in South America. And then that moved to North America, and yeah. Um, so yeah, the botany as a, really sort of exploitation of the natural world was pretty
Exploitation.
fundamental
Hmm.
to
Yeah.
the process of colonization.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose the difference is, and this is something that you and I have kind of talked briefly about a couple of times, is like how different things are in Australia compared to America. And like looking at like how did those voyages, how did they arrive, and were they trading with the natives? Were they did like say the difference between New Zealand and America and Australia
Yeah,
and these
yeah,
places, like
yeah,
was a treaty formed, like because Australia never had a treaty. The indigenous people
yeah,
here were regarded as animals. Australia is regarded as having no human inhabitants, only animals, and therefore we could just kind of do whatever we wanted instead of having a trade agreement. And yeah, I know that, yeah, you know a lot more about that than what I do, but it's really
yeah,
interesting if you kind of look at the historical context, because in America, you know, for example, like the herbal medicine community is a much more activated, like integrative practitioners, and clinics are very common, like grassroots herbal educators. You can what is the word, you can learn from your grandmother and become a practitioner just through through the rights of your blood lineage, you know, having that handed down. And they've got everything there, from the universities to the apprenticeships, and so much more, I suppose, freedom. It feels like they have so much more freedom in America than what
yeah,
Australia does, in
yeah.
terms of, and pathways as well. And I think a lot of that's to do with the history, but you would know a lot more about the comparison of the history of, like, say, those three
Yeah, I mean,
countries.
it is interesting as to why in North America, there's it seems to me that herbal medicine is much more related to political activism than it is in either the UK or Australia. And I think that's got to do somewhat with the fact that that there's such a there's no social security safety net. I, you know,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
and so there's a requirement. So I mean, one of the things I remember when I um, my first trip to the States, which was in about 1990, and I went to the first meeting of the American Herbalist Guild, um, and I went out to dinner with
Cool.
some American herbalists that I just met, and the first question that they asked me was, "Sue, what's your protocol for abortion?" And it was like, what? Like, I mean, I always practice where abortion is safe and legal, and people don't die because it is legal. But of course,
Hmm.
over there, it's a completely different situation, and certainly was, in those days, and probably now again, given the political. And it's like, okay, theoretically, I might know some herbs that that might cause an abortion, but like it's not something that I'd ever been put in a moral position to actually say, well, would I prescribe this? Because I was always able to say, well, you want an abortion, go and go and see your go and see your GP. But they hadn't, and I think there's a lot of things like that. I mean, no, there's not a lot of situations like abortion, but I do know that there seems to be a much. My experience was always that the idea of yeah, needing to be regulated, or being on that there was a much more of a cavalier attitude towards what the law was, yeah, yeah. Um, but in terms of transmission of medicinal plant knowledge, I have looked, the question I put myself at one stage was, why was there transfer of medicinal plant knowledge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in the Americas, and there wasn't in Australia?
Hmm.
um, and lots of reasons, and that we've mentioned before. I mean, one reason would be that the flora of the eastern seaboard of North America and the flora of Europe is quite similar. So early
Hmm.
settlers going there, and also at the time that, I mean, of course, the States was settled before Australia, and at that time early settlers, who of course weren't convicts. I mean, they were free settlers going to religious freedom. Um, Early settlers seeing plants, so okay, so this plant looks like valerian. I know valerian from home. It might be a different species of valerian, but let's experiment and see whether it's the same thing. So that similarity was one thing. Another thing was that the relationships with Indigenous in those early days in the States were based on trade. And so if you're trading for furs or you're trading for food or whatever you're trading for, then you're going to be trading for other things as well. And interestingly, that's also the situation in New Zealand, that early relationships with Maori were for trade. And interestingly, in New Zealand and in America, that there's more there's been more use of Indigenous plants as medicines, Indigenous medicinal plants. Whereas in Australia, of course, the first fleet, the first settlers were were convicts and certainly weren't expected to survive. I mean, the British didn't think that there was much chance of the penal settlement being successful. And so I think that there wasn't that trading relationship. And also I do think that it's got to do with scale and population, because one of the things, I mean, if you read about the history of the industry, of the herbal industry in North America in those early days, and you and the physiomedicalists and all of that, what you're talking about there,
eclectics,
and the eclectics, and the Lloyds and all of that. You're talking about a lot of people, so you're talking about big markets, and so I mean, if you're just looking at, say, somebody like Thompson, and okay, so he had this great idea that okay, we'll get together this small number of herbs and we'll sell them to people that are going to settle out west, and they're settling out west in family communities, and they'll need things to look after their family's healthcare. I've always thought, well, okay, so the way that Australia was settled, Australia was never settled as closely as the States were settled. I mean, the land isn't as fertile, and so if there were, and also a lot of the properties were very big properties, and they didn't have a lot of families on there. They might have had one manager. So you have an Indigenous group sharing their knowledge of a particular plant with, say, a particular family somewhere in Queensland. Like, it never becomes commercialized. I mean, it's never, like, there's never enough of it, and there's never enough people to actually turn it into a commodity. And although we can be distressed about the fact that herbs become commodities, one of the things, when a herb does become a commodity, it's one of the ways of holding on to the information about it. You're selling chamomile tea, therefore you need to know what chamomile does. You're selling poke root, so you need to know what poke root does, and you need to know about the toxicity of poke root or whatever. But if you never sell it, if it's just something that grows on your property, and maybe it only grows in that area and it doesn't grow, in Victoria as well as it grows in Queensland, that's another reason why I think, if there was, if there was transfer of medicinal plant knowledge, and there does seem to be, we've got evidence of some transfer early on, then somehow it never stuck, like it was. And I'd say part of that was because, like, what's Australia's population? Was it 28 million, 30 million? What's America's population? 300? Like, I mean, my stats might be out of date, but, that's the sort of difference that we're talking in terms of, well, and this also gets back to your point about herbal education. Yes, there's a lot of herbal education in the States, and there's a great variety of herbal education, but we're so much smaller here, and you might find, if you looked at it proportionally, it might not be as different as it seems to be, because there's just so many people over there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it's you've raised some really great points there. And also, while you were saying that, I was thinking about how, like, if we were a penal settlement and so many people were convicts, probably not as well educated as a lot of the people that settled in America that would have been more likely to be able to read and more have brought already books with them and be more inclined to document
Yeah,
findings
yeah.
of like
And
you know.
were farmers, were, wanted to, and saw the possibility of actually, I mean, although of course those early settlements also, people nearly starved, but yes, certainly the agricultural expertise and the familiarity of the landmass, you know, that this is, that this is the oldest landmass in the world, and so the plants are so different from Europe. The way things work are so different, and that's one of the things that's so interesting to look at when you um, look at the early colonial history. How did people make sense of this upside downness of being here, and you know how things how I mean I know even coming home in the 80s, and plants that I'd learnt about in my course in the 70s. I mean, I'd learned that, St. John's wort, for example, was one of those plants that, it's a bit of a nervine and it's got these other actions, but really, it's not particular, like it's, you can always tell from your teachers, can't you? Like the ones that they really believe in and the ones that they're just telling you because it's on the curriculum, or, you need to know. And certainly St. John's wort was, it's on the curriculum, you need to know, but really, you use other nervines instead. Came home, started using St. John's wort that Greg had harvested, up close to, where they were living in Benalla. And it was like, holy moly, and patients would say, look, hey, Sue, like, I'm not sure I should be driving a car on that, and and it's like, well, okay, so there's, the St. John's wort that was growing, growing in central Victoria at that time was so much stronger, than the St. John's wort that I'd learnt about. I'm not sure how I got onto that. Anyway,
Yeah,
but
it had the freshness and the vitality and everything.
yeah,
And something that I wonder. I hope to see more people digging in archives or in family histories. I hope to see more boxes dropped in people's offices of some stuff they found in someone's attic, because I wonder about stuff like plantain. Like plantain that comes from Europe. But we've got like 24 different known varieties of plantain indigenous to Australia, but yet I can't find recorded information about indigenous use of plantain. And I wonder about the settlers coming here and seeing that plant and kind of using it much the same, or having conversations with the locals to compare usages of their indigenous uses of that plant, and learning from each other, because that, even though there was all this like devastation that happened back then, and not that long ago, the devastation was still continuing. But like, I just wonder about all of the conversations that happened, or the sharing of information that would have happened, like you say, spread out more in families on land that would have been more a personal sharing of information. I do kind of wonder about that, if a lot of that, if that was recorded anywhere for us to learn from.
well, I mean, it's worth going back to look at the archives of the first, of the earliest doctors that came out on those early ships, because all those doctors were botanists, and so they talked about plants that would be useful. And there was a native smilax, sarsaparilla, that was preferred by herbalists in Australia until the 1920s. That was identified pretty early on. So so how much recording is there? I know, I mean, we've got old family letters from the mid 1800s, from relatives in the UK writing to relatives here, and obviously talking about health problems, and recommendations for homeopathics, that coming from the family in the UK to the family in Australia. Have you tried, this particular homeopathic? This of course is when letters took 6 months to get each way, and so. But the story of the story of healthcare and the way that health information and health habits have been transferred, between different peoples. Yeah, different communities is pretty
For
interesting.
some reason, it seems to just get left out of the story so often. So, like, we were talking about Hill End. I had an ancestor that settled there, but he settled there after he'd been on an expedition up here. The Kennedy expedition was one of one of the famous
Okay.
expeditions that they were the first white people to come through this whole area that I live at now. And they came through, and anyway, they all died off, including Kennedy himself. And the only three remainers were my ancestor, the botanist that was with them, and their indigenous tracker Jackie that they had with them. And anyway, I've thoroughly read over all of the all the diaries and all of the everything that was kind of recorded or remained from that expedition, and there's just like no, they're all dying of starvation and malnutrition and getting infections that just wouldn't heal. And I wonder, like, in all of these recounts, they weren't talking about, like, what medicines did they bring them with them in the 1850s. They kind of jumped off the ship with 100 sheep and 23 horses and proceeded to try to hack through the rainforest and travel intense distances. And it's like, what medicines are with them? Like, did they I just find it really interesting that it's not even in the story anywhere. Like, it's so much focus on so many other aspects of the journey, but not about the medicines. It just seems like missing from the story.
Yeah. I agree. That lots of those.
There's this interesting thing over time that, like, this kind of this quiet, this silence around herbalism, or this kind of oppression, or this kind of recurring themes that have kind of come up. But always like to look to the future with bright eyes and look at what I don't like to think we're going to be continuing this cycle. I like to think about what we can do to get out of that and to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about continuing the cycle. I mean, humans aren't going to survive if plants don't survive. On this planet, and as long as there are plants, there will be plant medicine. And it absolutely it's so important that we keep using the plants, I suppose, and that we keep growing them, and even just using the very simple remedies, and really putting energy into, okay, what grows locally, and not only what grows locally, but what are the actions of the local plant, of the chamomile that grows here, as opposed to,
it's got a totally different
as opposed to the chamomile that grows where you are, as opposed to the chamomile that grows on the other side of the world. And how do we foster those relationships, and just try and make those supply chains a bit shorter, that we really now, I don't know how realistic that is in terms of, when one goes to Chemist Warehouse and sees the, enormous range of products, there. But, as practitioners, we can certainly grow our own remedies and make our own, maybe not a full dispensary, but just that, just the satisfaction. I mean, as I said, I live in inner city Melbourne. We've got a park just behind us. There's a community garden there that a few of us look after, and it's like, I mean, if I walk around that community garden, there's probably, it's not a herb garden, but there'd be 25 or 30 medicinals in that garden, and it is, it's lovely just to have them around, and to be able to use them. One of the other, I wear a few hats these days, and one of the hats that I wear is part of a environment and sustainability special interest group with the NHAA, and we've just put out I guess a flow chart of questions that people can ask about, okay, when I'm purchasing plants, how do I we know that the supply chains are pretty opaque, and one of the things that would be great would be a bit more transparency about supply chains. But even if we just start thinking about, well, okay, what part of the plant is used. So we know that if it's the flower or the leaf, it's not likely to be sustainability issues. But if it's the bark or the root, there's probably other questions that we need to ask. And if it's the root, and the next question is, well, okay, so where does it grow, and how easily does it grow, and how long does it take to grow? If it's a dandelion root, hey, not likely to be a problem. If it's rhodiola, for example, and it's going to take, so much longer, not only it's going to take so many years to mature, but also it grows in such a specialized part of the world. And because it grows in cold climate and the planet is warming, then that is becoming more difficult. Then maybe that's something that we need to think twice about using, and that's even before we get on to, okay, so what's the conditions under which, this herb that I'm purchasing, do I know where it was grown? Do I know whether it was fair trade? Do I know whether there was ecological damage, whether it was wild harvested or cultivated? There are a whole lot of questions that as herbalists, we really need to start asking. Firstly, asking about the herbs that we use, but also educating our patients, because if not us, who? If not now, when? Yeah. So it is, and it is. I mean, these are supply chains and have been things that feel like a few of us have been banging on for a long time, but there does, I think, the sense of urgency is growing. And I think that's one thing. One of the gifts of COVID, was seeing, well, okay, just how dependent are we on imported herbs, and how many grow here, and how can we encourage more more local people to be growing the plants that we need.
Yeah, there's a lot of support from the government for food farmers, but how amazing would it be to have that support be offered from the government as well, and for herb farmers, for medicine growers in Australia, because that would be a pretty amazing point to get to if we were growing at least most of our country's herbal medicine.
And
supporting,
it's likely that we won't ever grow everything, but we could certainly increase the amount that we're growing, and also if we could, hopefully not turn those all into monocultures, that we're just having acres and acres of peppermint or whatever, but actually a variety, having a variety of plants.
Grow them sustainably, have kind of just models like Gould's farm around Australia, where it's like that's really sustainable, beautiful quantities. If kind of every community had something like that, every region had something like that, we'd be doing really well.
And I think a lot of that is, it's really, these are passion projects, and one of the big problems that we have is that so many of our manufacturers will tell us that it's not commercially viable, because to grow in Australia, because our wages are so high. But maybe there are other ways that we need to think about value adding for that. And if we are going to be getting plants that are locally grown, or that we know the supply chain, we're probably going to have to spend more money on them. But one of the problems, I think, that has come to us with the move towards evidence-based medicine has been that we do look at maximum safe doses rather than minimum effective doses, and we think that because something is stronger, then it's going to be better. And this is not herbalist particularly, but this is part of we think about that in all sorts of areas. But I mean, to look at getting back to more low-tech preparations that are closer to the plant themselves, to understanding more about the plant, and looking at, well, okay, what can we, how can we get back to using the plants in the ways that they have traditionally been used? I mean, one of the big problems of evidence-based medicine is that if we're trying to do a clinical trial, then not only do we need a standardized form of that plant, but we also need it to be strong enough that it gives us a measurable result in a reasonably short period of time. You know, subjective feelings of well-being don't cut it in a clinical trial. You've got to be able to measure the change,
Yeah.
which means that you're going to have to use more raw material. You're going to have to make a more concentrated extract. You're going to have to, and this is all the manufacturers say, okay, our extract is particularly effective. Very often it's more concentrated. And of course, the other thing is about that is that then it uses more raw material. So if you're using larger doses of herbs to make a more concentrated extract to make a measurable change, actually that's not traditionally how herbs were used. We were used in a much more...
And you're more likely to have side effects as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the safety profile of a herbal tea compared to the safety profile of a very concentrated extract, like they're not going to be the same. But we do, we've moved away from the low tech to the high tech, and I think that that's certainly got problems associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've also moved away because a lot of those, with that evidence-based medicine's not always using fresh plants. Like,
Absolutely,
it's, there's a different experience when someone goes out to their yard or their community garden or their local farmer or whatever and sources fresh, vital medicine that they only, just need to have a small amount of. But just that fresh vitality isn't often, as far as I know, doesn't really make it into those trials, and that it's often already so far removed from its like natural state, and it's been kind of messed with. And
and one of the issues is
there's some
it's like, well, okay, so when we're talking quality, what do we mean by quality? And by quality in herbal medicine, are we talking about, okay, this is freshly dried, appropriately, and and it still smells and tastes and like all of that, or
has color.
has color, all that sort of thing, or are we just depending on levels of active constituents, and are we trying to standardize medicines to the same active constituent, which may or may not be the appropriate active. There are different ways to look at quality, and I think that's we say, oh, quality herbal medicine, we all know what we're talking about. Well, no, how do you measure quality?
Yeah. What was the soil health? What was the microbial health of the soil that it was growing in? And what were the intentions of the farmers that grew it and the people that were harvesting it? What were their intentions and their thoughts? And there's actually so much that goes into like a potent medicine, or that can go into a potent medicine every step along the way. And often when I'm reading like, clinical trials or reading different studies that are made, I'm like, I feel like I'm missing out a lot of the variables of what what made this medicine to begin with, how it was grown and harvested and everything.
Because I think, certainly evidence-based medicine and evidence-based herbal medicine has come a long way, but you don't have to go back terribly far to be reading trials or reading case histories or even, particularly reports of toxicity where there really hasn't been a definitive identification of the plant, And so, and sure, like in the 1970s, people who were writing about plants from a non-herbal perspective didn't know all the questions to ask. And yes, they've come a long way, but there's certainly been a lot of misinformation and false information about medicinal plants out there.
Was the plant even identified correctly, or was it adulterated potentially? Like, has it been imported and adulterated?
So many, endlessly fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating.
But it's important stuff to think about and to talk about. And I love your passion for like sustainable medicine as well, like moving forward, and your passion for Australia to become more sustainable with with our medicine. And I wonder if you might like to share a little bit as well about like the national symposium that's coming up,
Oh,
and
yeah. Yes,
some
yeah,
of your
yes, yeah,
thoughts around
yeah,
incorporating Australian Indigenous
yeah,
native medicines as
yeah,
well into
yeah,
our
yeah.
Materia
Well, this is
Medica.
this is something that I've been involved with through my work with the Jacka Foundation for Natural Therapies, and Nickham Health Institute at University of Western Sydney is putting on um, is it a symposium? As I'm putting on a conference on traditional medicines in November, and it's it's being run by, jointly put on by ANU and University of Western Sydney, um, and bringing together anthropologists and chemists and um, Indigenous groups and commercial groups to be talking about, how Indigenous remedies might be brought to market, and to try and establish, just to start a dialogue in this very contested area. And one of the projects that the Jacka Foundation has given a small amount of a small contribution to, but it's been going on for a long time, is the Majala project, where which has been a project between a group in Western Australia and Griffith University, and a lot of people have been involved in it. The story was that an Aboriginal elder was out bush and was fishing one day, had his finger severed by a crocodile, bound the finger with a particular bark on the way back to camp, which alleviates pain. And there's been a lot of work, and that subsequently, don't know all the details of the story, but subsequently the community decided that they wanted to bring that pain relieving bark to market, and so people have been working on it for many decades. It's been initiated by the community in Western Australia, and there's lots of different aspects to it. But it's certainly the people involved are all trying to make this, like a model case for how this might work. That the whole thing of how Indigenous remedies might be brought to market with appropriate acknowledgement of the groups who own them, intellectual property, ideas, the benefit sharing, all of that kind of stuff. Obviously, something that is full of, it can be a minefield, but what the organisers are hoping from this conference is to actually bring some dialogue between major actors in this area, and having a voice for Indigenous as well as the people who might be contributing towards bringing it to market, as well as TGA, so chemists, anthropologists, regulators, community members. So that would be a really interesting 2-day conference that's coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. That's down in New South Wales, isn't it?
Yeah,
That
yeah, at
conference.
Sydney. So just if you Google Traditional Medicines Conference, Nickham Health Institute at Western Sydney University, yeah, you can come up with the details.
Yeah, because it's really important that we don't just do what's been done through history and just exploit the local medicines, So, it's really good to be having those conversations with the right people in the right way,
That's
and
right, yeah.
make sure it's if we are going to utilize the medicines here, that we do it sustainably,
Sustainably and respectfully.
yeah,
And giving it, appropriate recognition to all the different people who'll be bringing it to market, but also acknowledging the flora of the country that we live in, of the land that we're on.
yeah. Yeah, so I feel like we're at a really interesting point in history, and I wonder where it's going to be at in another 10 years or another 20 years or, 50 years.
That's right, yes. Yeah. Well, I would just hope for, more people respecting the non-human worlds, I suppose, is that as humans, we're only part of the planet as humans, and we need to decenter de- decenter ourselves, and think about and give appropriate recognition and rights to non-human uh, our non-human relatives.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
the plants,
definitely.
the rivers, the land,
That's the
whatever.
mindset shift. That's the mindset
That's the
shift that needs
mindset
to
shift.
happen.
Yes, yeah. And I mean,
Yeah.
I remember you used to say that, we need the sort of shift that's required for us to stop sticking Roundup or other weed killers on dandelion and start recognizing it for the potent medicine that it is. It's a kind of
Yeah.
mindset shift that is required if humans are going to be able to survive on this planet. Um, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, yeah, enjoy those dandelions. Mm.
So could you share a little bit with us about, like, I suppose what you're up to at the moment, like what projects you're working on? You mentioned Jacka
Yeah,
Foundation, and UTAS, and like what's coming up for you?
yeah.
Where are
Well,
things at and where are
I
they
guess that's
going?
yeah. Well, I guess that it's not sure where they're going. I'm enjoying the project. So the projects that I'm involved with, um, I teach a unit at University of Tasmania on complementary medicine in contemporary society, and I enjoy that. Um, and then I'm on the board of the Jacka Foundation for Natural Therapies, and that is certainly it's a joy to be involved with a group of people who have the ability to actually fund some projects in natural medicine. And so we've funded a number of different projects, and one of our big one of the big projects that we fund is contributing towards Nickham Health Institute, but also there's been some PhD scholarships and other projects, again, on the website. Um, so yes, and then of course there's, as I've mentioned, I work with the Naturopaths and Herbalists Association on their sustainability and environment group. Um, and I guess in terms of work, that would be they're probably the major things that I do. The other stuff is I guess um, now with more and more with a number of grandchildren, it's like family is also pretty important. One of the things that I would say
Mm-hmm.
is that one of the things that I've found in terms of being a herbalist is that herbal medicine is, or being a herbalist, um, brings such joy in travel, because wherever you go in the world, there's always people who are using plant medicine. I mean, plants have been used in all cultures at all times. You can always find a herbalist, and when you find people using herbal medicine somewhere else in the world, really language doesn't matter so much. You can actually communicate. Um, one of my my kids and his family now live in Munich, and so I've found that actually trying to spend time with the family there, and certainly understand more about that area, has been a joy to, because a lot of naturopathic roots actually come from that part of Germany. Um, I'm trained as a herbalist, not as a naturopath, but I've hung around naturopaths long enough. Um, Father Knipe was one of the founders of naturopathy, and a couple of years ago, when I was visiting my family, a friend and I went down and stayed in his monastery in Bavaria, and did the dew walking, and just actually getting a sense of, okay, what's the history of the water therapies in southern Germany. So really, wherever you go in the world, there are people using plants as medicine, and people interested in natural medicine, and I think that's one of the it's absolutely one of the unexpected joys that I've found. Um,
Mm.
yeah, in my career. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
There's always
beautiful that
something.
you've been able to travel and, you know, learn in the UK and
Yeah,
learn in Australia and go, you know, go to South America and,
yeah,
you know, also like you mentioned just you know, in passing earlier that in 1990 you were at the first American Herbalist Guild meeting, and like that just kind of we went brushed past that, but that's massive. Like that would have been what, like Michael Tierra, Christopher Hobson that were probably there. Some of the some pretty big formative
and
people
well,
would have been
and
there at that meeting.
yeah, and Michael Tierra, and I was also there at their 25th, and at their 25th,
Oh,
Michael Tierra said that the reason that the American herb that he started the American Herbalist Guild, he started the first mention of the American Herbalist Guild was after a conversation that he and I had when he was out here in Byron Bay in, I don't know, 80s, I suppose. And I challenged him, and I said, well, who's the herbal group? Like, we have National Herbalist Association, and we've had National Herbalist Association since 1920. Like, who's your group, Michael? Like, what do you mean you don't have a herbal group? And he thought, oh, okay. And so he actually said, so yeah, so in that 25th, when I was there 25 years later, yeah, that was really sweet. But he got up and said, actually, it's because of a conversation
wow.
I had with Sue Evans that I started the American Herbalist Guild.
That's pretty cool. That's a great. See, you're just making history. You're not just you know, you're an active part of creating history.
Yes, I mean, I certainly have been, yeah, yeah. I've had the opportunity to, be in NHAA. I think my first meeting in NHAA was in about 1982 or three or something. Um, yeah, so yeah. I've just and because I've been able to teach and practice. I think one of my very early memories being in that tiny classroom in Tunbridge Wells and Heinz Alstra, teaching us, giving us dictating the notes of Materia Medica. I just remember after some conversation just sitting there and thinking there are just so many things you can do as a herbalist. There are so many aspects. You can research, you can grow, you can practice, you can get involved in the history. Like, you will never be bored, like you can, and, to think that I've been involved in herbal medicine for nearly 50 years is just pretty crazy. But I certainly haven't been doing the same thing for 50 years. Yeah, there have been a lot of different aspects that I've been lucky enough to be part of. Yeah, yeah. There you go.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for everything you've shared today.
Yeah, good
Yeah,
talking to you.
it's
Yeah,
definitely not enough time. It feels like the tip of the iceberg, but
yeah,
it's really
yeah,
great to
yeah,
get a bit of insight into your journey. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
thank you. Thanks for
Good,
everything that you've shared
great.
here
Thanks,
with us
thanks,
today.
Tricky. It's been fun chatting about it.
Um,
Yeah,
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 I just wonder if you have any parting words or a message for our listeners out there.
yeah, yeah. Um, no, I think it's just, I guess, to be a herbalist is just you're really just part of, you know, a stream that goes back to Hippocratic times. Like, as lot,
Mm.
read, Clan of the Cave Bear, like, I mean, all of human history, we've always, animals use plants. We learn from the animals, and it's just this, we're just part of a stream, part of a river. And,
Mm.
yes, it might be tough sometimes and all that kind of stuff. But it's an enormous privilege to have been part of this work. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's all.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sue.
Okay, all right. Talk to you later, Twiggy.
Really appreciate our chat today.
Okay, see ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Herbal Education segment of the Elder Tree podcast. Stay tuned every new moon as I interview more wise and inspiring herbal educators and herbal lore keepers from around Australia. If you would like to go deeper with the podcast journey, you can become a member of the Elder Tree Trove on Patreon. Contribute as little as $2 per week to access free content from our interviewees and also access discount codes and opportunities which are exclusive to our members. You can find us on Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/theeldertree. Other ways that you can assist us in getting our offerings out there to more people in Australia is by subscribing and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and on the Spotify app. Also, liking, commenting on and sharing our social media posts actually has a really positive impact and helps us to reach further with the message from all of the amazing herbal lore keepers that we interview on this podcast. Thank you so much for your support and have a most wonderful day.